Hello and welcome to another Atypical Philosopher video. This is a slight crossover between politics, my Ukraine war series, and just general philosophizing about existential threats. Because this is about Putin going nuclear, or at least threatening to do so. So what happened? Well, a few days back, Putin said, and I wrote an article about this on September the 26th, on my birthday. Whoop. That's how I roll. Will Putin go nuclear? You can find out on onlysky.media. That's where I'm a journalist. So will Putin go nuclear? In this, we have Putin and as part of his speech, quoted as saying, "I would like to remind those who make such statements about Russia that our country also possesses various means of destruction, and in some cases they are more modern than those of NATO countries." So this is Putin responding to what he claims is the West making accusations or making sort of threats of nuclear war ourselves. That simply hasn't happened. Right, so he's basically lying. I mean, this is mainly for his own audiences at home, internally. But he's also kind of admitting that his nuclear armaments aren't really generally as modern as the West has. Some of them are. This is quite an interesting admission. But anyway, I digress. And in some cases, they are more modern than those of NATO countries. When the territorial integrity of our country is threatened, we, of course, will use all the means at our disposal to protect Russia and our people. This is not a bluff, he says. And those who try to blackmail us with nuclear weapons should know that the weather vane can turn and point towards them. This is incredible. It's deeply hypocritical. It's saying, look, if you're going to blackmail us with nuclear war, we can do the same to you, right back at you. The problem is we haven't threatened him. He's invaded another. So when he talked earlier about when the territorial integrity of our country is threatened, it hasn't been. You invaded a sovereign nation, so you did that. Now, what's interesting is these referenda that are taking place now will allow Russia, or at least in their own from their own perspective, to claim that at least 2 out of 4 of these states, but possibly all of them, are now the proper sovereign territory of Russia. So they've invaded them, given a bunch of sham referenda, and said, oh, look, everyone wants to be part of Russia, even though half the people have run away to different places, and the other half are answering under gunpoint, and actually most people didn't answer at all. They locked their doors and didn't come out. So effectively, we're just going to make up the numbers. So they made up the numbers, like 99% in Donetsk, I think it was, to say that they wanted to be part of Russia. Yeah, of course, that's what's happened. It didn't happen. It's Russian lies. But he says when the territorial integrity of our country is threatened, which means that if Ukraine, with the help of the West, threaten Donetsk and Luhansk, for example, and try to liberate those territories that are now partially occupied, they're not even fully occupied, they're partially occupied. So there's even less basis for a referendum. Then they have the right to hit those aggressors who are threatening the territorial integrity of Russia. And the big threat, all he has to go to really is the nuclear option. Now, if nuclear didn't exist, Russia would have lost this war 6 months ago. NATO has the capability of taking out the entire Russian armed services like that. If you combine the almost 30 nations of NATO, we could, look, they can't even beat Ukraine, right? They're supposed to be the second greatest army in the world, the Russians, and it turns out they're the second greatest army in Ukraine. The Ukrainian army has done better than the Russians. So we could, with our technology, literally, we could take out the Black Sea Fleet like that. We could take out we'd be ready to do that, and we could do it with relative ease. But we don't do that. Why don't we do that? Because he's got his finger over the nuclear button. Okay. So this is the big thing that he always falls back on, to give Russia the safety from being attacked by anyone else. And what he does is he pushes the envelope. He pushes everything to its limits in terms of what he can get away with. So he invaded Crimea and annexed Luhansk and Donetsk, or at least parts of, back in 2014. He got away with that. It's like, right, what can I get away with now? And it's okay, as soon as they put up any resistance, I'll just threaten nuclear war. Okay, but this time, we've gone through 7 months of war in Ukraine, and people aren't really up for Russia doing this kind of saber-rattling. Saber-rattling is kind of like, showing how strong you are, rattling your sword and saying, hey, look how strong I am, don't mess with me. And it's kind of a show of bravado. And Putin's historically been very good at that. But now we're not, I don't think we're going to be scared. So he's now threatened nuclear warfare if, things go south. Well, things are going to go south for Russia. There is no way that, the mobilized forces are going to be a game changer. He's going to lose. So the question is, how is the West reacting, and are we heading towards a nuclear war? And I guess there are a bunch of options, but what was really interesting is on Sunday on CBS, Jake Sullivan was interviewed, and he's a White House National Security Advisor, and he said a whole bunch of really interesting things. Here's a transcript of that CBS interview with Jake Sullivan, Face the Nation. This is one of the most important things he said. Sullivan, it's true. So the question was, but he hasn't been as cornered as he is now. Sullivan says, yeah, it's true. And it is a matter that we have to take deadly seriously, because it is a matter of paramount seriousness. The possible use of nuclear weapons for the first time since the Second World War. We have communicated directly, privately, very high levels to the Kremlin that any use of nuclear weapons will be met with catastrophic consequences for Russia, that the United States and our allies will respond decisively. Okay, let's unpick that. Generally, what happens in these kinds of situations is you have something called strategic ambiguity or useful ambiguity. Useful ambiguity is when you say things that can be taken in several ways. Right? I could do A or I could do B, but I'm going to say X. And X could cover A and it could cover B. And what it means is the person that I'm negotiating with, or the person I'm threatening, or the person I'm talking with doesn't quite know what I'm going to do and what I intend to do. Doesn't know whether X means A or X means B. And so there's a useful ambiguity that keeps the other person on their toes and trying to second guess and not being sure. And when you're not sure, you're a little bit more conservative, a little bit more guarded. What's interesting here is that Sullivan and the Americans appear to have thrown away useful ambiguity and actually gone straight privately to the Kremlin. And I believe other nations have been speaking, and laid on, we have communicated directly, privately, at the very high levels to the Kremlin that any use of nuclear weapons will be met with catastrophic consequences for Russia. Now, the ambiguity is for us now, the general public. What will be met with catastrophic consequences for Russia? That's the question. So he continues, and we have been clear and specific about what that will entail. So there's no ambiguity there. Russia know what the US will do. Or at least that's what the US are telling us. We have been clear and specific about what that will entail, what the reaction to use of nuclear weapons will be. We have in public been equally clear as a matter of principle that the United States will respond decisively if Russia uses nuclear weapons, and that we will continue to support Ukraine in its efforts to defend its country and defend its democracy. Wow. Okay, so what does this mean? First of all, let's think about nuclear weapons. Well, at the moment, Russia has nuclear weapons that are approximately 700 times more powerful than the Nagasaki and Hiroshima bombs. So the capabilities are massive. And they have a shed load of nuclear weapons, ranging from tactical ones that will just take out a couple of square kilometers, That's generally what is understood that they will use. So if they use nuclear weapons, it will be on the battlefield for tactical reasons. Tactical nukes means the smaller battlefield tactics, not the overall war strategy. So the tactics will be, right, we're going to wipe out this town or this village or whatever, take out these particular armaments, maybe a bunch of nuclear tactical nukes, and then afterwards we'll drive in our troops in vehicles that were designed to be sort of anti-radiation. We'll pill up our troops with iodine tablets, and we'll drive in and execute the Russian doctrine of warfare, which is to do that, to use tactical nukes, flatten everywhere, and go in afterwards. That's kind of what they're doing with artillery at the moment in the whole war, is they're flattening moonscaping areas and then driving in afterwards with relatively few troops. So that's what they would do, and that's because everything else has failed. They are not getting anywhere with conventional warfare. They have failed. Their air force is impotent, their navy is impotent, and their troops are impotent. They have got no answer to the capability of the Ukrainians and the NATO suppliers. They can only meet that capability with capacity, which is shoving in a bunch of poorly trained, low morale troops as cannon fodder, and hope for a Pyrrhic victory where you overcome the enemy just with sheer numbers. And you're going to lose far more troops than the enemy, but you'll win eventually because you've just got shed loads more troops. That seems to be what the Russian strategy is at the moment. So Sullivan is saying, well, we will react decisively. Now, what does that mean? If the Russians, the first thing to note is if the Russians move any nuclear armaments, NATO intelligence will know straight away. We've long been monitoring all their missile silos and missile transportation, so that literally as soon as those garage doors are opened to move a missile, we will know. So that actually puts the advantage potentially back in NATO's favour, which is you could make proactive strikes. But okay, let's forget proactive strikes. We would know what these missiles would be doing. If the NATO acts decisively, does this mean using nuclear weapons back at Russia? It could do. And actually, this is where there's an ambiguity for us, but I don't know that Russia have been delivered that ambiguity. It seems like US has communicated decisively and clearly. But it could be, and actually I would argue that this is more probable, is that if Russia released tactical nukes, then we would hit back with conventional warfare and not nuclear warfare. We could destroy those nukes proactively. We could hit them in the air. I don't know what happens to nukes if they're hit in the air and taken down, whether they will release their radiation wherever they land. But the Ukrainians already have pretty decent capability of taking out cruise missiles. All nuclear missiles will be basically larger nuclear armed cruise missiles. But they could be, being larger, easier to hit in the air. And so therefore, and US has just promised 16 more NASAMS. So these are anti-air, like Norwegian US anti-surface-to-air missiles that act as really effective defense. I've got a radar range of 120 kilometers and I think a missile range of somewhere around, I don't know, 40 kilometers or something. And then there's obviously all the defences that NATO will throw in to help protect, as soon as they are needed against nuclear. So the missiles could be shot out of the air. Or if nuclear missiles get through and land on Ukraine, then it could be that NATO could react in NATO or the US, both. Either is likely to be all of NATO. So, I mean, Russia it would be an act of self-harm. It's just suicide. We could hit a bunch of their nuclear armaments, missile defense systems, or attack systems, their missile systems, or we could take out, for example, it could be that the Black Sea Fleet is just sunk. Like it would be relatively easy for the Russian Navy to be taken out by a coordinated NATO air attack. I think it really would be very easy. And so the Russians could end up losing, most of their navy by releasing a couple of nukes. And then the Russians would be like, okay, what do we do now? Is that escalatory, or do they go, okay, we're on a hiding to nothing? If they release more nukes, then, who knows where that would go. But the point is, retaliation to Russian nukes doesn't have to be a nuclear retaliation. It can be using conventional warfare and hitting them in places that will massively hurt. Yes, so some people find a difference between tactical nukes and massive nukes. So a nuke that can take out just a couple of square kilometers compared to like the biggest nuke possible that's 700 times Nagasaki. Some people differentiate that, other people don't, and they say it's just a matter of size, but these are still, nuclear weapons. And therefore, you use any form of nuclear weapon, we will react. So, but for those who think actually tactical nukes are almost a different category, then, it's arguably appropriate to be able to react to that, the use of those conventionally, and just wipe out loads of Russian stuff with conventional warfare. Because that can be just as damaging as a 2 square kilometer nuke strike. The other option, of course, is that nukes could be sent back into Russia, and this could be all-out nuclear war. It turns out that NATO has broadly the same amount of nukes as Russia. The problem is, we have seen during this conflict in Ukraine that the Russians are sending out a bunch of Caliber cruise missiles, and a load of them are falling out of the sky because they malfunction. A bunch of this has happened. Like Belgorod, where some of them are being shot from, have been hit. Belgorod itself as a city has been hit by falling Caliber missiles of their own side. They fire them up and straight away they just fall out of the sky because they're so poorly maintained. Russian nuclear missiles in all likelihood, are going to be equally poorly maintained. And there is a lot of, reason to think, and people do genuinely think this, that there is no guarantee that the nuclear missiles will work, at least not all of them, and work to the way that... So Russia could end up firing a few nuclear missiles, maybe 5, and like 2 of them fall out of the sky straight away. So they've got an issue with that. But yes, so we could enter a nuclear war where, again, Russia would probably be wiped out straight away. Would China come to their rescue? I think China have only got about 320 nuclear weapons themselves. That sounds like an awful lot, but compared to the rest of the world, actually, that's not very much. And so really it's and I don't think they'd want to get involved. I think, let everyone else have a nuclear war, and actually they could come out the world superpower because everywhere else has been. But then would there be a massive nuclear winter, etc., etc.? There's all this kind of game theorizing as to what would go on. But there's every chance that NATO, I think, would just be able to cripple Russia really quickly. Now, what about Russia itself? So to release a nuclear missile, it's not like Putin has a single button and just goes, oh yeah, I'm going to press that. Actually, there's a whole process that has to go on that will involve lots of other military leaders. In order to get that through, in order for things to happen, it's a complex system. Which means that there are other people involved that could veto that process. So if Putin says, right, it's time for nuclear, there's every chance that there are generals around him who will say, no, actually, this is a red line's been crossed here. No, and it's time for a coup. We're not going to allow this. This is just, geopolitical harikiri, and we'll be committing suicide on the world stage, both kind of literally and politically. So it's not as if Putin could just press a button and start a nuclear war. It's far more complex. And that gives greater chance that he could fail, given what would take place amongst those in power around him. Should we be worried? Yes, of course we should be worried. There's a non-zero chance of this happening, of course. Is it saber-rattling? Yes, Putin is definitely good at that. Is there a really strong chance it will happen? I guess the problem has always been that the better Ukraine do, the worse it is for Ukraine in the world in the long run. What I mean by this is that as soon as Ukraine start winning the war, Putin starts getting desperate because he can't be losing. then he loses face, he loses political and public support, and that's the end of him as a leader. And he could end up even being imprisoned and whatever going forward. He's supposedly the richest man in the world with the amount of money he's siphoned off Russia over the last 20 years. That's all for nothing. His own life is at risk. So this is an existential crisis for Putin himself. In other words, if Ukraine really start winning as they are now, he's got very few options. His stepping stone towards nuclear missile throwing is mobilization. He's gone for partial mobilization, but it's really a full mobilization that's dressed up as partial, because he can actually mobilize however many people he wants, which is why everyone's running away, trying to get to other countries. So we have this situation whereby Putin has done as much as he could, and really the next step is going to be using nuclear weapons. So we should be prepared for that, and the US has been talking with Ukraine and discussing, you know, how to react and what to do in these situations. But the US, and no doubt all the other NATO countries, have been putting contingency plans in place, as they probably have been since the very beginning of this conflict, to the point that I'm sure we are super prepared for the eventuality of Putin deciding to go through with that. I just don't know that he will get to the point of actually being able to release a nuclear missile, either with NATO preemptively striking or his own generals deciding, no, this is over. Because at the end of the day, the Russian generals know, in the Kremlin, know that Putin's war has been a disaster. Everyone knows it's been a disaster who knows what's going on, because the stats don't lie. Russia have taken a whooping here, and it's massively embarrassing. And going forward, this has loads of ramifications. So, for example, the military-industrial complex in Russia is a very big component of the economy, the Russian economy, and a very big component of their kind of soft power globally. It turns out that everyone's looking at the Russian military hardware being stuffed left, right, and centre, and being easily outmaneuvered and shown as inferior in terms of capability than the NATO hardware. And so when you are other countries looking for, well, let's say you're Saudi Arabia, you've got a bunch of money you want to spend, where are we going to spend that money? Are we going to look to Russia to buy a bunch of aircraft, or are we going to look to the States or BAE Systems or wherever? NATO countries are coming out with their equipment in a much better situation. So the ramifications of Russia losing this war aren't just about losing a bunch of troops and losing a bunch of hardware, but it's losing face in terms of their technological and military capabilities worldwide, and being able to sell that to other countries. So there are so many problems for what Russia is doing that the generals will realise this, and they'll realise that if this continues, like, the long-term future of Russia is doomed. But Putin has to save face. So this is Putin, the needs and desires and intentions of Putin against the needs and desires and intentions of the generals in terms of what's best for Russia as a whole right now and going forward. And all these variables will be at play for the other players in the Kremlin. And it's going to be very interesting to see what happens. Within there's the Financial Times, just to sort of consolidate what I've been saying. The Financial Times article, Kyiv's Western allies boost nuclear deterrence after Putin's threats. Again, it's quoting Jake Sullivan, but it talks about 5 different experts who have cast their opinions anonymously, because, you know, this is all pretty high risk stuff, and they don't want to say who they are, etc., etc. So here we are. While they believe Putin's threats are unlikely to materialize and do not signal a formal shift in the Kremlin's nuclear strategy, Kyiv's allies are increasing nuclear vigilance and deterrence, according to 5 Western officials who spoke under the condition of anonymity because of the sensitivity of the matter. If he thinks the threat is going to intimidate Ukraine into capitulating or giving up 20% of its territory, or intimidate the rest of us away from helping Ukraine, the opposite has happened, one US senior official said. Two other Western officials said the nuclear strike against Ukraine would be unlikely to spark a retaliation in kind, but would instead trigger conventional military responses from the Western states to punish Russia. That's exactly what I was saying earlier. So actually, it turns out that of these five, a good proportion of them are saying we wouldn't retaliate in terms of nuclear, we would do conventional warfare. Another official said there are a lot of red lines and they are probably not in a place where Putin says they are. The West's assessment of Putin's warnings that he is not bluffing about launching nuclear attacks on Ukraine are designed to regain momentum after Russian setbacks on the battlefield. These threats come as Moscow prepares to annex occupied territories in eastern and southern Ukraine following referendums hastily staged by Kremlin proxies. So is this more about, communicating internally to his own Russian public to make him appear stronger than he is and Russia to be in a stronger position than they are? Under Russia's nuclear doctrine, this could justify the use of nuclear weapons to protect the country's territorial integrity, as mentioned. But three of the five officials said that NATO member states have also communicated that message privately to Moscow, highlighting the scale of the response that any use of nuclear weapons would trigger. They suggested this threat of retaliation would continue to be the best deterrent. We've done similar private messaging, even more precise about the impact it would have in terms of Russia's pariah state status and our response, the senior US official said. So they're obviously warning Russia that if they do this, they will be the pariah state. No one will have anything to do with Russia because they started nuclear war. There'll just be even China and India and places that are generally more supportive, game over. The US has also discussed scenarios with the Ukrainians about possible nuclear use and walk-through protection and safety, the official added. So there you go. There are different options open, and it appears, although we don't know what the Americans have said, and these NATO officials have said to Russia, we can only second guess, but there are several options open, and it doesn't necessarily mean a nuclear retaliation, and it could be more likely that conventional retaliation is more effective if targeted well. But again, would that be hitting stuff inside Russia? Would that be hitting Russian stuff in Ukraine? Would it be hitting the navy of Russia, the submarines of Russia? What would happen? So anyway, there you go. It's a non-zero threat. It's unlikely. If it does happen, I think we'd probably get preemptive strikes in there first or hit these things as they were happening. And there's also a very real chance that, Putin will be deposed by his own people around him. What do you think? Let me know below. Was that interesting? Do you think the stuff I'm saying makes any sense? Is there anything I've missed? Your thoughts on a postcard, please. Or if not, just down below in the comments. Please like, subscribe, share, and help out in any way you can if you're willing. Thank you so much. Take care. Speak to you again tomorrow.